The alt-right represents a brand of two-faced conservatism that in one breath declares itself the savior of Western civilization, and in the other, eschews the principles that created it. Western civilization is defined by a multitude of different cultures, values, and movements, some of which stand in opposition to one another. Romanticism stands in opposition to Enlightenment. Marxism stands opposite to capitalism. Fascism opposite to liberalism. All of these fall under the wide umbrella of Western values. What the alt-right mean by Western values or Western culture is their own unique brand of it. They mean an idea of Western culture that they have created and fetishized, but is seemingly built on a rejection of a variety of other Western ideas that they dislike, from freedom and democracy to liberalism and speech. They are a movement that values a uniformity to society. They value a uniform way of thinking, speaking, dressing, and living. To understand how they are toxic to culture, we have to understand just what culture is. Culture is defined by a group's philosophy, tastes, music, art, and norms. The integration of other cultures is how new subcultures have been birthed. Expressionism gave way to abstract art. Its musical counterpart in jazz uprooted established structures of music with heavy emphasis on improvisation, and did so with the influence of a prominent Black American musical culture. The blues stylings of B.B. King, or the whimsical guitar of Stanley Jordan, have influenced and shaped our cultural appreciation for this music. Our architecture spans from the utility of Bauhaus stylings, repudiated by the Nazis as representative of Marxist intellectualism, to the grandiose Baroque that makes up Renaissance church architecture. The problem with saying Western culture as if it was a monolith of homogeneity is that it ignores the diversity of cultures that make it up. When the alt-right talk about Western values, do you think they're talking about Marxism? When they discuss women's roles in society, do they speak positively of feminism, a Western movement? What do you think they think of rap, a Western style of music? How would they reconcile defending John Rawls' philosophy on justice with racial segregation? None of this necessarily requires an answer. Those who claim to protect any of this haven't studied it, and those who have studied it dislike all of it. What the alt-right actually mean by Western culture is fascism. They want a society that looks a certain way, thinks a certain way, and acts a certain way. If it's their way, it's Western culture. If they dislike it, it's Jewish subversion. Part of embracing a shared culture is coming to terms with the aspects of it you might not necessarily like. I disagree with what you say but defend to death your right to say it is a popular phrase that can be traced to Voltaire. Tolerance of different ideas is a root value of Western culture, but the ideology of the alt-right have historically stood in opposition to this thesis. In fact, historically, culture's most violent destruction came at the hands of zealous ethno-nationalists. Nazi Germany was no stranger to culture. With an iron fist, they dictated what was culturally permissible. Artists were ranked on a scale of degeneracy by state apparatuses that sanctioned art that was not sufficiently German enough. More than 16,000 works of art were confiscated by the Reich Ministry for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. Jazz music was also restricted. Teachers of these styles were dismissed as teachers. Expressionist art was also restricted, prompting Goebbels to respond to criticism. We National Socialists are not unmodern. We are the carrier of a new modernity. A slap in the face of modernity. The degenerate art exhibition would disappear many works of modern art, works which are likely collecting dust in some unsuspecting family's cellar, unappreciated and away from the modern world, or works that would inevitably be victim to an Allied bombing, or to Nazi kerosene. Ein Kanot by John Metzinger, confiscated by the Nazis in 1936 for degeneracy, and missing ever since. Der Schützengraben by Otto Dix, confiscated by Nazi Germany in 1937 for degeneracy, and missing ever since. Landschaft bei Paris by Albert Gleizes, confiscated by the Nazis in 1937 for degeneracy, and missing ever since. In 1933, German student unions, at the behest of Nazi officials, began a campaign of book burnings. Books that were seen as Jewish subversion were burned over a pyre. Books from Karl Marx, Heinrich and Thomas Mann, and other books seen as a threat to German purity were singled out and eventually banned. The actions of the Nazis represented a crime against knowledge itself. However, far from being ashamed of the fear of ideas, the Nationalists were proud. The books were burned in a square at the State Opera in Berlin, and it was there that Joseph Goebbels joined a spirited crowd of Nazi youths to declare his opposition to ideas that threatened the German spirit. No to decadence and moral corruption. Yes to decency and morality in family and state, cried Goebbels.
Deutsche Männer und Frauen, das Zeitalter eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende. Und der Durchbruch der deutschen Revolution hat auf dem deutschen Weg wieder die Gasse freigemacht. Und der kommende deutsche Mensch wird nicht nur ein Mensch des Buches, sondern auch ein Mensch des Charakters sein. Und dazu wollen wir euch erziehen. Jung schon den Mut zu haben, dem Leben in die erbarmungslosen Augen hineinzuschauen. Die Furcht vor dem Tode zu verlernen, um vor dem Tode wieder Ehrfurcht zu bekommen. Das ist die Aufgabe dieses jungen Geschlechts. Und deshalb tu dir gut daran, um diese mitternächtige Stunde den Ungeist der Vergangenheit den Flammen anzuvertrauen. Das ist eine starke, große und symbolische Handlung. Eine Handlung, die vor aller Welt dokumentieren soll. Hier sinkt die geistige Grundlage der Novemberrepublik zu Boden. Aber aus diesen Trümmern wird sich siegreich erheben der Phönix eines neuen Geistes.
Ernst Kirchner's work was defined by its gestural expressionism. His works have a distorted feel to them. A veteran of the First World War, Kirchner lived a life plagued by disability and depression. Kirchner was a member of the Prussian Academy of Arts in Berlin when the Nazi Party ascended to power. Only a few years later, he would be banned from the Berlin Academy of Arts. In 1937, Nazi Germany seized his works from museums, totaling some 639 works of Kirchner's art. Then, shortly thereafter, a select few were presented to the German people as an example of art the Nazis labeled as degenerate. This was part of a broader effort by the Nationalists to cleanse Germany of what they saw as degenerate art. Kirchner was just one victim. The appreciation his art once had evaporated with the rise of the Nazis, and, in 1938, Ernst Ludwig Kirchner shot himself in the heart, killing him. Imagine a world where the alt-right held power. Imagine that they took control of all government right now. Do you honestly think they would not replicate the same crimes as before? Let's take a second to imagine the art they would call degenerate. Perhaps this crucifix with a soft warm glow, aesthetically appealing to the average viewer. The degeneracy comes from its name, Piss Christ by Andre Serrano. A series of Cibachrome prints subjected to numerous vandalisms from culture warriors who thought this art was degenerate, insulting, and beneath the form because it depicts a crucifix submerged in urine. The kicker to this is, if I hadn't told you this, would you have thought differently of this? Would you have seen the soft warm glow as harmonious? What of non-representational art? I happen to think Jackson Pollock's No. 5 is a brilliant work of art that others scoff at with a lazy remark of, I could have done this too. Would this too be degenerate? What of ethnic interpretations of classics? My favorite piece of classical music is Maurice Ravel's Bolero. Stanley Jordan took that classic and transformed it into a jazz fusion, adding a different cultural spice to it. Has Ravel's legacy really been destroyed because Stanley Jordan added some African drums and a Bansuri flute to it? Would this too need to be cleansed to protect the spirit of Western culture? Here's a question. Is there any difference between the destruction of art and literature seen as degenerate by the Nazis and the destruction of museum artifacts and the banning of music by ISIS? Aren't we simply at degrees of separation here? The arguments are basically interchangeable. We need to ban certain books because they represent degeneracy that threatens the purity of Western culture. We need to ban certain books because they are haram and they threaten the purity of Islamic culture. If there's a difference, I can't make heads or tails of it. The criticism I'll receive is that this is unfair. It is unfair to cast the crimes of the Nazis against the alt-right. The alt-right aren't advocating for book burnings, no more so than they're advocating for genocide or forced deportations. Indeed, they're not. But Nazi Germany didn't get that way overnight. A large cultural shift precipitated the destruction of what they saw as degenerate art. There is no reason to ignore the language similarities between the two. To the alt-right, the monster under their bed is a Jew. Ideas that oppose their hypernationalism are seen as Jewish. To them, porn is a Jewish conspiracy. Art and media that they dislike is cast as degenerate. In a podcast with Greg Conti, Richard Spencer goes on to admit that the alt-right are not even pro-free speech, but simply use the platform of free speech as a tool. If this isn't opposition to Western culture and the ideas it entails, what is? It's censorial, it's oppressive, it's intolerant, and I'd like it to stop before we resurrect book burning.
Yet again, Kraut. He's now in full damage control. Kraut is a doxer. This is a man that stewed on his own rage. Doxing server, the man who would actually little man, filthy, dirty, lying. The man who would actually, and unfortunately, only to have, as always, his lies. Fragile ego. Kraut is a liar. Littler and littler and littler by the day. Kraut is obviously not a good person. You, like Mundane Matt, have become a snickering joke of the internet.